Okay, so I just want to thank you to Kyle and Eleana for coming out tonight. Just to further what I mentioned a while ago is that we're going to be recording tonight's session. So whoever wasn't able to attend tonight, they'll hopefully be able to tune in. We'll probably try and post it on our Mississauga website or our YouTube. I believe we have a YouTube now. So if you want to just proceed with your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Peyton, and thanks for having us. I know it's. I'll start by saying, it's certainly not about bees, right? And you might be saying, "Oh my God, why are we listening to Kyle talk about lampreys? What the heck does he know about lampreys?" Luckily, Eleana knows a little bit more than me. And I guess what our goal was, or maybe not our goal, but kind of what we're asked or what we're thinking about when we had our initial conversations was, what else is there out there to know about lampreys, about lamprey control and all these elements. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the history of kind of the invasion of lamprey and maybe that's some control stuff that we think about very generally and broadly. But I'd also like us to maybe think about and talk about those other components that we don't necessarily think that are very important into the system. Right, so lampreys, we often look at them in a strange way. They're at least the sea lampreys that we're most concerned with. They're parasitic, right? There are these parasites that utilize other organisms or the energy, captured and gathered by those other organisms to support their own needs and to support their propagation. But they're cool, right? I have a funny cartoon picture here. But it shows, you can see all the really cool evolutionary adaptations. A really good sucker mouth, right? These teeth that can, latch on. A really streamlined body that, millions and millions of years of evolution that have allowed it to, inhabit either really fast-moving streams or inhabit and stay stuck and streamlined with the fish that it's attached to. So there's really, there's cool stuff to be learned about some of these organisms. We're thinking about, sea lamprey in particular. This is, the approximate, native range, that natural range of where we see sea lamprey. And we know with something like climate change, that range potentially will start to expand, right? Just like everything else. So, the temperature of the oceans, of these water bodies will change. And their range is predicted to expand. But something we haven't considered yet is if we look and take inventory of the entire global planet, what is the suitable range for native lamprey? Well, this is it. The deeper the red, the more suitable, the more ideal that habitat is. Right, that's very different from where we're finding lamprey, where we're potentially going to be finding lamprey in the next 30 years, and where we could potentially see lamprey going, or potentially where they could go if they had access to it. And this is a cool map that I really like to think about because it gives us an idea of the watershed. Right, and if we're thinking about what's a watershed, so this is all the water bodies, the streams, the ditches, the rivers that are associated or that are draining into a particular major water body. So we can generally classify these water bodies based on what Great Lake they're associated with. And across all these Great Lakes, what we have in the more intensifying colors is the more probabilistic of these areas, the greater probability of these areas actually housing larval lamprey. Right, so we can see in these deep, dark areas, these are the areas that generally have the greatest amount of lampreys. So this is information from the Great Lakes Aquatic Habitat Framework, just to give us an idea of, man, these lampreys are not just associated with these lakes, but again, with that terrestrial land surrounding all those streams and rivers that are connected to these water bodies. And I also think it's worth thinking about what are the Great Lakes. We often think about them as these, these entities that are, somewhat connected, somewhat not connected, but they change over time. Like our life experience, right? We live about 100 years if we're really lucky. That's a blink of an eye to a lake, to any water body. As you can see, thousands of years ago, the Great Lakes were covered by all these glaciers. And as they slowly receded, we had these giant lakes, these giant oceans that were very different than the lakes that we have today. Right, so if we look at something that, some of that early retreat of the glacier, we see these really huge lakes where both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are, much larger and much more connected, right? So we consider that entirety of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, Lake Algonquin, right? So depending on what geological period that you're looking at these lakes, you could say, oh, okay, there's one or two lakes here, and some scenarios like this, there's only one huge lake. And, oops, let me get here. And why am I talking about this? Well, because I think this gives us an idea of, what were the driving factors that resulted in certain types of fish population. Right, so you can imagine when things were a lot more connected, the fish populations were a lot more connected, right? You might see all through Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Lake Algonquin, this mishmash of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. You might all see those same types of fish populations because there's migration and the ability for fish to move and to populate all these areas. But if we think about 9,500 years ago, a couple thousand years after that other image, the Earth started rebounding. So the Earth got a little bit higher in certain areas. So lakes like Lake Huron and Lake Michigan were much smaller, but there's a greater connection to the lakes with the oceans. Right? So you can imagine you might have had all sorts of anadromous species that live half their time in the ocean, half their time in fresh water, make it all the way up the St. Lawrence River, get into Lake Erie, get into Lake Ontario, and kind of just scoot over in this really big Ottawa River when Ottawa River was just as big as the St. Lawrence is now. Right, so you can imagine that's the history of those species, of things that inhabit the lakes to this day. What I'd like us also to think about is looking at the lake in a very different way. We tend to always look at it topographically from the top, which is cool. But looking at it this way gives us an idea of, what are those actual barriers between our lakes? Right? We can think about, the Great Lakes. You can say it's, hundreds of billions. All right, I think it's 6 quadrillion gallons of water, 11,000 miles of coastline, 20%. Fresh water, but that doesn't tell us much. But what you can see here between, say, something like Lake Superior and Lake Huron are all these breaks, right? Sometimes they're natural, sometimes they're human-imposed barriers between our water bodies. So right here on the St. Mary's River, of course, we see the Soo Locks, right? Every time you drive over and you're going to Soo, Michigan, you'll see the Soo Locks, this physical barrier that equilibrates a little bit some of that water and allows boats to pass. But again, it serves as this physical barrier. Again, if we're kind of looking at Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, what's separating that? Well, Niagara Falls, right? There's not much that can go up and down Niagara Falls. So we have, again, this really large natural feature that continues or has historically divided the water bodies. And then again, we know dams block everything, which is not necessarily good for fish, especially fish that want to migrate or make it to the ocean and come back. There's not a way for them to get there anymore. So that's why, we experience a lot of landlockedness amongst fish. But, something that's pertinent to lamprey especially is, how did they get here? Well, for the most part, they were isolated to the Atlantic Ocean. There's no way for them to get into the Great Lakes. Again, we have the Niagara Falls that not a lot of things are actually going to risk crossing to get up or get around. But in the early 1800s, to be able, again, for economic reasons, to be able to move between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, there's this creation of the Welland Canal. Right, and it's this Welland Canal that resulted in those first observations of sea lamprey in Lake Ontario. Or from Lake Ontario into Lake Erie. So prior to the Welland Canal, the creation of this canal, we didn't actually have lamprey that were able to make it. Right, so it's a man-made problem. So what we see with lamprey right now, in terms of them being present, and their larvae being present across all our streams, all our rivers for the most part, is a man-made problem due to economic whatever. Right, people wanted to travel, have boats be able to ship goods across these lakes, and we've tackled it, right? I don't necessarily think we can say we solved this problem. Lampreys, if we look at their life cycle here on the left, they live part of their lives in salt water. But here in Mississauga and in the Great Lakes, now lamprey have completely adapted to fresh water. Right, so as adults, they utilize our streams and rivers to spawn. These eggs hatch into larvae that feed on all sorts of organic matter. Right, when you're a little baby lamprey, you're not parasitic, right? You're just eating organic. You're kind of not necessarily a bottom dweller, but you're kind of taking on detritus. You're eating a lot of already decomposed things. But where was I here? But eventually, as they start to migrate downstream to the big lakes, that's when they start to transform into their adult stages, right? And that's when they become actually detrimental to our fish populations, when they enter into this parasitic phase. And then, again, it happens all over again. They'll come back up the streams to spawn. And, before I was born, this was a huge problem in the 40s, 50s, right? It completely ruined whatever that Great Lakes fishery was, whether it's the big sports fishery or the commercial fishery. This evolution, the development of Great Lake or of sea lamprey, made it so that there was not an economical fishery to be had. And to this day, I think we're still limited by that big crash that we had in the 40s and 50s. But, something I do want to make sure that we think about is, yes, of course, sea lampreys continue to affect fish. Yes, we need to take care of them. We need to manage them somehow, because if these populations get out of control, they're really going to do some damage. But we also have to know that, yes, sea lamprey are bad. They're invasive. They're not adapted to our system, so there's nothing that can actually deal with them. But we also have other cool lamprey species, right? And I don't think we put enough thought about this. If we have a sea lamprey program, we should also have a native lamprey program, or at least we should be educating people about these to some extent. Right? We might have something cool like the American lamprey, because or the Northern Brook lamprey. These are two lampreys that still have very similar body forms, but they're not parasitic. Right? These are more filter feeders, right? So they're very much like clams or oysters. They're kind of just sucking things through, and they have these rakes to allow them to capture whatever goodness that they're filtering through. You still have the the disc sucking mechanism so that they can inhabit these same streams, but they have a very different lifestyle. So it's important to think about. We have the sea lamprey that has invaded, and it's likely affecting the native lamprey populations. So we also want to make sure that in our treatment or in how we think about lamprey control, that we're not also affecting some of these native lampreys that are really cute. And Eleana will talk more about some of the cool lampreys out there. So, we have something like the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. I think it was established around the 50s or so. And they have, for the most part, taken on that role of being the leaders and how we figure out how to manage lamprey so that we can start to think about restoring something like our native lake trout species, right? And and I don't want to spend too much time going into the history, but that initially, when we're trying to rebuild a lot of the populations of our stocked fish, there's this really huge or really poor survival of a lot of these fish that were stocked. And, this made it very clear to everybody trying to rehabilitate our fish populations that, okay, we need to really enhance the control of lampreys. And again, they started to expand the lamprey control program to Lake Ontario, and then further and further, they went up the stream to some of the other lakes. What else did I want to say? And of course, there's two chemicals that we use to, or not we, that they use to control sea lamprey, TFM, and what's the other one? Beluska. I think I have a slide about it. But I don't think it's worth thinking about these details. But what is important to know is how and when it targets it, right? So when we're applying something like TFM to streams, we're trying to apply this compound to the streams when these lamprey are larvals, kind of in their larva stage, right? And when they're cute little babies like this, right? They're more susceptible at this stage, and if you manage to kill and control those larvae, they never turn into adults to actually cause any damage. And over time, as they've been implementing a lot of these controls, they've actually started to decrease the amount of product that they had to use over time, right? So I think initially when they're applying the product, the active ingredient, the mean weight of the product that they're putting in was something like 170 kilograms per meter square per second. And ultimately, last data that I was able to find, they took that down by about 40 grams to about 120 kilograms per cubic meter per second, right? Which is an improvement, right? If we can apply, I'm not a guy who says pesticides are bad or good, but if we can start to apply these things more responsibly or be able to decrease and target them more specifically, I think that's doing a good job. And here's just a little figure kind of identifying, the years where lampricides were applied in kind of around the Georgian Bay, right? We have French River here. And you see, it's again, in my opinion, I study bees. We don't spray unnecessarily. Similarly with lampricide, there's this long outlook, this plan to make sure that we're not applying this thing yearly, but we're really selecting particular times that are, associated with ecological factors. I don't necessarily know what that decision-making process is, but again, it's important that we be able to see that is transparent, that people have a say in being able to determine what the future of these lampricide treatments should look like. I did want to highlight a few things here. Yes, lampricide's a fantastic control, right? It's focused, it's fairly targeted on lamprey themselves. But we also have physical barriers, and we know there's been a lot of research being put into all sorts of different types of barriers. Some that are, purpose-made sea lamprey barriers, right? These custom-built barriers can stop sea lamprey, right? They've been tested out. People have displayed their use. And again, it's also worth noting that we have a lot of barriers just in general, right? If we look at, it's Lake Huron barriers, you can see all sorts of different dams, right? And these dams actually are not necessarily for blocking of sea lamprey, but they actually do block sea lamprey, right? So they might be hydro dams or dams for different manufacturers or water control and flood control and things like that. But the fact that they exist, they're playing a role in being able to help us control sea lamprey. I think in general, there's, for every one dam or barrier used to control sea lamprey, there's 12 barriers or dams that are in existence that do some control of sea lamprey. So we don't have a lot of these barrier systems that are purposely meant to control sea lamprey. But again, just by the fact that people love using the power of water or taking control of water, that tends to benefit our ability to control or impede the movement of sea lamprey. But obviously, it also impedes the movement of native fish, native species that need to migrate up and down these these water bodies to spawn in particular rivers or streams or access the lake in certain areas. So again, this is kind of just what a basic dam looks like, right? I don't know why I'm showing this. It's just a fixed crest dam. It's the oldest and probably the most common purpose-built barrier in the Great Lakes Basin. You have that overhanging lip. You have, very particular water flow just to, it has to reach. Well, it doesn't have to. There's best practices in how you design these things to make sure that we can maximize the impediment to sea lamprey and them being able to move across the barrier. And there's all sorts of other cool things, right? We have these vertical screen barriers that are primarily used to block adult sea lamprey moving upstream. Sometimes they're associated with traps like on the left here, so you can actually trap out all sorts of adult sea lamprey. So again, just alternative control methods. And again, I'm not here to say one's better than the other, but I think it's important that we're aware of these issues. Similarly, I'm talking about pesticides and lampricides as though they're these great, beautiful, perfect products. If you're a chemist, yeah, you think, oh, these miracle compounds are miracles, especially when we didn't have them. Now we have them. But it's also important to acknowledge that no matter how good something is, there's going to be a side effect, right? And I'm just going to highlight two papers right here that are worth thinking about, where lampricide bioavailability, that is the active compounds of lampricide being available to be absorbed or kind of brought into tissue of an animal, is dependent on certain characteristics like alkalinity, pH, and that gill microenvironment of fish. Right, so we have all these, we have all sorts of environmental factors, or maybe even habitat water flow factors, that will affect how toxic something like lampricide is to sea lamprey, and potentially how toxic it is to non-target fish. That is non-sea lamprey, right? So the fish that we're hoping to keep. And it's not the fact that it's just all these things might kill our fish. There's also well-known non-lethal effects, right? And something, say in my world where I'm focused a lot on bumblebees, sometimes we often think, okay, a pesticide might kill a bumblebee, but it might just make that bumblebee dumb or really ineffective for the rest of its life. It might not die, but it will just not be able to perform all the things that perform all the duties that it needs to perform. Right? So that's a non-lethal effect. And again, a lampricide like TFM, might have non-target or effects on non-target fish species, right? It might affect long-term growth or behavior of fish, thereby affecting that long-term sustainability of fish population. It might not necessarily kill that fish, but it might make it hard, might make it skinnier, right? It might not be able to feed as voraciously, it might not be able to breed as effectively. So that's a longer-term effect it's really hard to measure, right? So it's really hard to know how something like lampricide is affecting fish when we have these long-term effects. And and onto the right here, just it kind of gives us an idea of some of the differences that we might see between something like a lake sturgeon or a rainbow trout. What we can see here is that certain non-target fish like lake sturgeon are more sensitive to lampricides in low pH, right, relative into something like high pH. So when we're thinking of applying lampricides, we have to, first of all, make sure that potentially there's no lake sturgeon in particularly acidic environments, maybe, right? So and I don't know at what level that these things are thought about, but if we're reading the data, if we're trying to be holistic when we're managing these things, it's worth thinking about this, because yes, you may not kill a fish, but I think hurting a fish is not good either. And we don't necessarily are always able to do that, right? So making sure that we have ways to think about this or ways to monitor that are really important. So yeah, non-target fish will not normally, encounter any lethal concentration of something like TFN. But relatively small changes in the pH, that might happen just because of rainfall, algae kind of utilizing sun and utilizing oxygen, maybe something happening in the sediment, things that, might be just relatively small pH changes can drastically affect the toxicity of these compounds, right? So yes, we monitor water pH. It's easy to do that type of stuff. But again, it's also just as easy sometimes to have the pH of the system change to such an extent that allows it to become a lot more dangerous than it was previously. So when we think about these decision-making matrices, when we're trying to decide anything, right? Whether it's do we treat lampreys with lampricide? Am I going to apply pesticide on something like my flea beetle in canola, which is big right here right now? Do I have to worry about applying some sort of pesticide for my blueberries at the end of the season because we have this new spotted-winged Drosophila, this new fruit fly that's eating all our blueberries? We have to make sure that every aspect or multiple aspects, and not just those associated with the lamprey, are evaluated. We have to think about these things from that ecosystem approach. We have to think of these ways from not only a Western approach, but also what are those values, what are those principles in our local knowledge systems that are important to be considered when we're building that decision matrix or that model that tells us, yes, we're going to treat, no, we're not going to treat, and how do we manage this in the future as we start to put a lot more questions into something like this. I kind of just want to touch on some of those big, broad, general topics, but I wanted to pass it over to Eleana because we've been, again, Eleana's the expert on these things to some extent, and she thinks about lamprey and a lot of these systems in a much more in-depth manner that might just give us ideas on how to potentially start thinking about the management or start thinking about how we treat or how we relate to some of these species and their habitats. Go ahead, Eleana.
Yep, just unmuting myself. So sorry, I'm hearing feedback from myself. Is there?
Let me just put my mic on mute. It might be me.
Yeah, cheers. Okay, yeah, no, perfect, thanks. So yeah, hi, I'm Eleana. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manitoba. So I'm from Greece. I moved to the other side of the world because I think lamprey are cool. And I study the native anadromous sea lamprey species. So a lot of the narrative about sea lamprey and lamprey in general is about controlling the invasive sea lamprey species, invasive sea lamprey in the Great Lakes, which of course is important. We don't want the invasive populations getting out of control. But other time people forget how many lamprey species exist and how cool they actually are. So lampreys are more ancient than any of us. They're considered living fossils, and they've survived several mass extinction events and now have to face trying to survive a world with what humans have done to it. And there's many species of lamprey around the globe, around 41 to 45 recognized species. And for some strange reason, most of these species actually occur in the north of the world. And there are not that many species in the southern part of the world. But all species have in common that they start off as a filter-feeding little burrowing larvae that spends its first years of its life in creeks and rivers, just filter-feeding in the sediment. And then it undergoes complete metamorphosis, changing from this little thing buried in the sediment to the strange, eel looking like fish that we all know. So like a butterfly, but more bitey and a bit more slimy. And after this metamorphosis, they will either have a parasitic life phase, so they can be anadromous. So after metamorphosis, migrating down to the sea where they spend a few years feeding and then migrating back up into the lakes and rivers to spawn, or they can be freshwater resident and just spend all their lives in the lakes and rivers. But some species can actually do both and have populations that will have both anadromous and freshwater resident populations. And then there's also lampreys that are non-parasitic and post-metamorphosis. They don't feed, they just remain in fresh water and spend the rest of their lives in their natal streams. And a lot of people don't think about this because they think that lamprey are always parasitic, but a lot aren't. And so when it comes to parasitism, non-parasitism, there is a theory that non-parasitic species have evolved from parasitic species. So each non-parasitic species has a parasitic ancestor. And small, of course, it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of research going on about what exactly is paired with what and what evolved from what, but it's a pretty cool concept. And small-bodied species do better at producing non-parasitic forms. So there's a size cutoff point above which a shift to non-parasitism is not beneficial, and it's based on size, but also linked to the reduction in reproductive output. And people did speculate whether freshwater resident parasitic sea lamprey is a jumping off point for evolution of non-parasitism, but calculations so far show that that is not the case, and unfortunately they're going to stay parasitic. The invasive populations are going to stay parasitic. Next slide, please. So when it comes to anadromy, freshwater residency, there's some anadromous species that have both large body forms and dwarf smaller forms that appear to feed at sea for a shorter period of time. And that freshwater establishment is more common in these small body species and species with these dwarf forms. But large body sea lampreys seem to be an exception, and they manage to make the transition to freshwater fairly easily. Sufficient prey base is needed for the transition to freshwater. So migrating is difficult for sea lamprey. They have to travel a decent distance, spend a lot of energy, they get predated on. Then after feeding at sea for a few years, they've got to move back up to spawn again. Energy is used up, predation, a lot of animals wanting to eat these lamprey, just moving up the streams in big numbers. So to move on to, so there are benefits for abandoning this migration, but they must make up for the decrease in size and reproductive output that will occur once freshwater residency is achieved. And research has shown so far that there is a pre-adaptation to freshwater residency in lampreys. So some lampreys are just wired to do better in freshwater. So there's lampreys of all shapes and sizes across the entirety of the world, and a lot of these lampreys are very much appreciated. So I just wanted to take a bit of time to talk about culturally important lampreys across the world. So they've been harvested by humans since ancient times, and usually the parasitic migratory species with a larger body size were preferred. And usually they're targeted upon their return to rivers to spawn, that's when they have the highest level of body fat, and humans and animals really can benefit from that. So it's important to think about conservation of native lamprey species because they have a lot to deal with. There's climate change, overfishing, habitat loss and degradation. And it's just to mention a couple of these cool lamprey species across the world. We have Pacific lamprey, which is an anadromous species. It reaches up to 8 centimeters in length and distributed from across the Pacific, Baja California in the east, the Bering and Chukchi Seas to the north, Russia and Japan to the west. It's an important resource for Indigenous people in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, where it's valued as a traditional food source and for medicinal purposes. And on the complete other side of the world, we have the pouch lamprey. And this is the prettiest species. It's iridescent and nice colors. And for some strange reason, once the males get a bit older, they get this rather large pouch under their chin. It looks pretty weird. And it's one of the largest anadromous species in the southern hemisphere, around 57 centimeters in length. And it's found across southwestern and southeastern Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, and South Georgia Island. It's traditionally harvested by Maori people who consider it to be a delicacy and have health benefits. But for some reason, they won't eat the male pouch lamprey once they actually develop that big pouch that hangs from their chin. Then we have also the Arctic lamprey. It's an anadromous medium-sized species, around 63 centimeters in length. It's distributed from Siberian coast to Canada in the Arctic basin, Bering Sea south to Japan and Korea in the Pacific. And it's also found north of Russia and Norway in the Arctic White and Barents Sea basins. This one's harvested in Japan, Russia, and by indigenous people in the parts of the Yukon River. Especially the people that mainly harvest Arctic lamprey are the Russians. It's eaten a lot. And interestingly, in the Russian Far East, there's people that will use dried lamprey as candles. And then, of course, we can't forget the sea lampreys. So apart from the invasive populations in the Great Lakes, they're anadromous in their native range, found in the North Atlantic, on both the European and North American coasts, and in the West Mediterranean Sea. And they're the largest lamprey species, and they can reach up to 1.5 meters in length, maybe more. And they're harvested in Spain, Portugal, and France mainly. And so the Portuguese really love the sea lamprey. They have festivals dedicated to eating sea lamprey. They will typically boil them in their own blood and serve them with rice. And they even have brotherhoods that are dedicated to eating sea lamprey and sea lamprey conservation. So a very different perspective for what's used to in this area. And I would like to take a moment and talk about the potential future of a research project that me and Kyle are thinking of applying for. So we would like to focus on sturgeon, being the culturally important species that it is, and being also the species that's most likely to be affected from lampricide treatments. And these are some ideas. This is just some ideas we're thinking about, and we're thinking about using genetic methods and indigenous knowledge, and also environmental data to assess the state of sturgeon populations and their health, and kind of integrate this into thinking about prioritizing and informing conservation efforts. And why I think this is really cool is because I do think that conservation efforts should be localized and tailored to the needs of the ecosystem and the communities that live there. And this would be a really great opportunity to do that. And yeah, pass it back to Kyle. What do you think, Kyle?
Yeah. So this is not about let's save the lamprey. It's not about let's all eat the lamprey. It's not about let's do research or any of these things. But I think what we want to highlight, and what's kind of exciting to think about for Eleana and myself is all these other cultures have evolved. Not only ways to think about and manage lamprey species, but also ways how to incorporate it into their culture and really have it become, something that they think about, right? Something that they have some local knowledge about. And I think we maybe we don't take it for granted, but I think Canada, the rest of the world takes for granted just how much, how big that relationship is with our species and our water bodies, right? Again, just kind of looking at the Robertson Huron Treaty or the Treaty of 1819, or the Southern Ontario land surrenders, there's so many communities along these streams, within these areas where we likely have larval lamprey, how much say do they have in the future of, what happens with not just lamprey species, but with any of our water bodies? And we're seeing increasingly that need to be able to not just incorporate, but have Indigenous groups, communities, people on those big tables, designing those objectives, designing, what should people be researching? What should Kyle and Eleana be thinking about, right? Well, how does this benefit us? Where do we want to go? How do we create new Indigenous knowledge associated with these things? Again, just looking at the Lake Huron water basin, right? So this is what we consider kind of that drainage basin associated with Lake Huron. And we can already see there's, where we're at right now, there's still a lot of forests, but if, again, if we look at our cousins just below across the lake on us, most of that natural habitat is gone. It's increasingly becoming more intensified, right? All that yellow represents agriculture. So not only are these areas, potentially already infested with lamprey larvae, but already that habitat is potentially degraded because of, some of the negative effects that just naturally happen with agriculture. Again, I'm not here to say that agriculture is bad, but we know as we transform landscapes into something a little bit more managed, we're going to start affecting the environment and its ability and capacity to hold species, native species, and biodiversity. And I think as we start moving forward in science, there's a huge Indigenous science conference here at the University of Manitoba this week. We're seeing a lot of ideas and a lot of Indigenous peoples partnering with scientists or Indigenous scientists, helping communities build some sort of, philosophy and way to be able to utilize those tools and some of the techniques we use in science to actually make their own Indigenous science. So yes, I am sure everybody's seen GIS layers or Google Maps and things like that, but you can put in a whole bunch more things than just the vegetation type, just roads, right? You can put in, that local information. You can put in sacred sites and, keep that sacred too, but, document them. You can put in really culturally important harvesting areas. You can put in areas that are just really special to you for whatever reason that might be, right? And you can create these ways to start categorizing and building, these land management strategies that actually are able to take into account, those values, those principles that we think need to be thought of when we're thinking of any type of development or any type of treatment or any type of management. And again, this is just kind of a really cool matrix that I found looking at different Maori values, right? So in New Zealand, we know the Maori have a really big say in all environmental policy, in all environmental planning, in all management, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic. Everything almost has to be reviewed through this lens of, does it meet these Maori values? Right? So if we could say, if we look at all the things that happen in Ontario or around Mississauga, do all these things meet the 7 grandfather teachings? Or can elaborate it in any way we want. But if we start asking those questions, we're going to see how many of the things that we do in the environment actually do not. Right? So how do we challenge, our scientists, our researchers, myself, government scientists, whoever, those private industry, how do I challenge them and make sure that they're operating on the land, the things that they're doing on the land are meeting those values and principles? So you might, this might be fun to think about these things through some classification thing like this, when we're looking at something like sacred sites at the national level, at the individual level, at the clan level, maybe at the gender-based analysis level, right? And thinking about how we manage land in just a more diversified lens. Because I think it's important that, that local knowledge of animals, that's what everybody loves to get from Indigenous people. Tell me about this, tell me about these fish. And they write it up, and they make that plan. But Indigenous people and community need to be involved at that land and resource management system, right? Fickrick Burks, who used to teach here at the University of Manitoba, he saw traditional knowledge as this adaptive management, as the management system that needs to adapt to those needs and the knowledge of local people. And once we start getting our values, our principles, and maybe even our data into the system, that's when we're going to be able to better changing social institutions. That's our governments, that's our universities, and how we teach these things. And then ultimately, once you start educating people about these things, that's what changes the worldview, our perspectives, and how we manage something like Lamprey, how we manage something like climate change, when those values and principles of Indigenous people can actually make it to that world stage, and they're actually viewed equitably with something like Western science. So, that's kind of all I want to have us talk about, was just to think about science as this opportunity, this reparational opportunity. I think science has a duty to Indigenous people, to women, to minorities, to immigrants, because science for a long time has just fueled the machine of the economy, of the neoliberal economy, right? And we know that what that has done to our planet. But I think increasingly people are willing and interested to think about science as this ability to bring environmental justice back to the world a little bit. And, Eleana's talking about, Lamprey being these old ass things, right? These things that predate us by millions of years. And it's important to think about the history of the land. A lot of the problems we're seeing now only happened since colonial times, right? This happened because Canada has been colonized by these European powers, and they've taken and transformed all of our ecological systems. They justified this through thinking, the Americas were empty, so we did everybody a favor. But again, Canada has forgotten, and sometimes, depending on what you're doing as a Canadian government or as a big industry like mining or fossil fuels, it's easier, it's convenient to forget that all this land is Indian land. All this land is Indigenous land that was wrongfully taken. Treaties be damned, in my opinion. So it's important that now, if this land is going to be taken, you also have these people become partners, equal partners in a lot of that decision making. So again, this is a paper from one of my great friends that I went to school with, talking about utilizing models like two-eyed seeing, where we're looking at problems through both Indigenous and Western lenses, and that's really important if we're going to start managing our environmental and our ecological systems a little bit more equitably. So thanks for letting us go on and talk about random stuff for a little bit. It's super fun.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation tonight. That was wonderful. I do have a question though. So on one of your slides, when you were talking about the decrease of the toxicity of lampricide, how it's decreased over time, I was wondering if you think that sea lamprey are capable of becoming more tolerable over time.
Yeah. So that slide wasn't. I don't think it was necessarily the. I think I might have misspoke, but I think it was decreasing the amount they were using. Yeah. So they're just using. So yeah, and I think that probably lessens the potential for, say, non-target toxicity. But can lamprey become, have some sort of mutation and become immune? 100%. That's the beauty of evolution, right? People say, oh my God, I hate when somebody or some insect or something develops some resistance to something. Yeah, it sucks, but that's the beauty of diversity and evolution, right? It's bound to happen. And I don't know as much as I should about something like TFM, but generally, and I don't know if people have predicted, I'll ask Eleana if she knows anything in specific first.
I don't know the specifics of it, but people are very worried about sea lamprey adapting to lampricide treatments, and there is research happening as we speak on if that's possible, how to what extent that is possible. So yeah, definitely something worrying.
And it's especially concerning because we only use 2 types of chemicals, right? And once something develops a resistance to one, it's very hard for that population to ever become susceptible to it again, right? It has populations and generations organisms, they have to not see that for a long time for that resistance to leave. So yeah, again, it's a huge issue. And again, I had that slide about the intervals of treatment. That potentially, helps slow down that evolution of resistance, which is nice. But again, like Eleana was saying, you need a lot of research to be able to predict this. And again, it's a really hard type of research to get done.
Okay, and I had another question. Do you know how long it takes for the bailicide to photodegrade? And if there are any known byproducts from the mixture of, because as we all know, like the characteristics of lakes and rivers are all different from one another. And I was just wondering if there was any known research on the byproducts.
Yeah, so I know that, and I'm looking at it right now. So there has been some research looking at exposing something like TFM into say tributary systems exposed to either the spring or fall natural sunlight levels, and they of course they have identified what those breakdown products are, right? So you have these weird compounds. So I think the half-life, well, maybe I'll start with the easy question. I think the half-life of something like TFM, where half of it is degraded, is about 3 days in a natural, sunlight, full sunlight system. I don't know much about the breakdown product, but it's 2,5-dihydroxybenzoic acid. And again, it's a great question. I don't know if there's any environmental concern associated with any of those breakdown products. Eleana?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so Peyton, I'll send over some of these papers that I'll pull from Google Scholar just to give you a little bit of reading. There seems to be a little bit of work. Hey, again, I think there's always a need for more work like this. So it's important to understand that environmental fate of anything that we have. So there's been a few reviews, so I'll send them over and kind of highlight where those answers might be found for you. Right, and again, I'm not here to. We're not here to vilify any of these things, and just like most pesticides and things like that, though there is some sort of regulatory framework. These things exist. Are these things perfect? No, right? We know science is so far from perfect, and I think it's important. Again, you're asking really cool questions that I think are important to ask. The people that you're partnered with in doing this and stuff like that, to make sure that if they don't have good answers to all these questions, why don't we have good answers to all these questions? Sure, there's we probably have the beginning answers to all these questions, but what are those additional things we need to know?
We had a question from a community member. We were just wondering if you knew, like, at what size do sea lampreys start targeting lake sturgeon?
What size? Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it will vary, right? You could be at a particular life age and be of various sizes depending on how successful of a filter feeder you are, right? So if you're doing really good in the environment and you're a really fat larva, you're going to be a really fat, young adult as you start going down the river again. So I don't know what the average stage is or the average size of those lamprey.
Size of lake sturgeon.
Or was that Peyton?
I was saying, at like, what size would a lake sturgeon approximately be?
Oh, what size would the sturgeon be? Well,
Because they wouldn't be able to target like a smaller lake sturgeon, right?
you know what? I've seen lamprey on really small fish before. Like really, I mean, on all sorts of, yeah. I've seen them on like small little lake trout, small little salmon coming up. Yeah. So I don't know if there's a limit. I think they're pretty opportunistic.
I think that lamprey will just go and attach on anything they can get their jaws on. Oh, sorry, not jaw. They're jawless. They don't have jaws. Their teeth.
Oh my God, are you even a lampreyologist?
I went for a figure of speech and then I realized my mistake. Anything they can sink their teeth in, I think they will. They're pretty opportunistic. I wouldn't think they have a limit to lake sturgeon size or any fish size. They can latch on.
You know, and they can switch hosts too, right? So it's not like they have to pick that perfect host to say, oh, I'm picking one that's it for the rest of my life. No, right? The lamprey can switch hosts, so they can suck the living life out of something, even if it's small. Say, okay, I better go find somebody else now. Which is unfortunate for fish.
Okay, thank you. I don't think do we have any more questions before we? Okay.
Definitely Kyle, if somebody has any questions after we will be able to the website. Questions.
Okay. I would just like to have this in the video is just to say that if any community members watching have any further questions in regards to the sea lamprey, they can contact myself. My email is peyton@mississaugi.com, and I can do my best to get the proper information forwarded to anybody. And I just want to also say Chimigwech to Kyle and Eleana for their presentation tonight. We really appreciate your time and your assistance in ensuring that we, get as much information to the community as possible. Project our communities informed and just aware of the presence of sea lamprey and the effects of it, and just to have as much information available as possible. So your time is greatly appreciated this evening.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so with that being said, I'll let you both go, and I'll be in touch. Have a great evening, and Bama Pikoab and Minwa.
Later, Peyton. Later, everybody.
Bye.
Good job, Eleana.